Remember the Scoob movie? Yeah, that movie is now just past its 4th year anniversary. This movie was certainly a time in our lives. Coming out in the midst of lockdown back in the olden days of 2020, I remember kicking and screaming about this movie because of release dates. I still stand by it that in a global world where everything's connected by the internet, it's kind of a waste of time to just have region-based release dates that are like a month apart from the UK and the US. And that's not even talking about the worst case scenarios like poor Australia getting shafted half the time. Still, as much as I was clawing my way to go and witness this movie, not a month late compared to everyone else, this movie was also just kind of a fever dream of what is Warner Brothers doing. Of course, nowadays when we look at Warner Brothers, the state of their animation scene is even worse than could be imagined. But I think maybe Scoob might have been the last squeak of goodness they produced, if you could even describe this as goodness. You know, they brought it out, it kinda happened, and they made some interesting choices along the way. The actual idea behind Scoob is a really interesting one at first, and then the more you explain the details, the more it warps further and further off into some weird spiraling territory. Scooby-Doo, obviously, a 2D cartoon, so seeing them incorporated into 3D is interesting. You know, you might not like it, but it's interesting. I can see the vibe behind it. I mean, it worked for the SpongeBob movies as much as we don't like that it happens in the SpongeBob movies. And like the visual aesthetic is nice. It's not quite Illumination basic, and it's not at all like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles flair, but it looks interesting, and is a nice classic 2-hour runtime of a good Scooby-Doo mystery, you know? The Scooby-Doo movies of another breed are incredibly adored. So it would only make sense that a lot of us would be on board for a movie like this, but this movie was set to be more than just a Scooby-Doo movie. Do you remember this? Do you remember the conversations surrounding this movie? Because I was hyped for this movie conceptually, because this was set to be a Hanna-Barbera cinematic universe. Yeah, remember that? The Scooby-Doo cast aren't the only people that make an appearance. You've also got the likes of Captain Caveman, you got the Blue Falcon and Dino Mutt. And a particular stand-up for me was, of course, Dick Dastardly making an appearance as well. As a guy who loved wacky races and just wants to see Waluigi on the big screen in some form, this was just a great idea conceptually, if only they could land the premise of this movie. For Warner Brothers to be able to create a whole new universe with a whole bunch of IP that they own and keep it going really does sound like a brilliant brainstorming idea to, you know, continue the brand. But that's not really what happened, is it? I mean, for a start, this movie begins with a 3D rendition of Simon Cowell critiquing the cast, which is not even an updated joke when it came out. In fact, I would argue it was a dated joke when it was already done in Shrek 2 in 2004. To be out of touch and out of date is putting an understatement to this movie. Add on to the fact the story plot lines they decided to go on. Making a cinematic universe is already a hot topic for, you know, failure. It's only really been done successfully once. Usually you kind of need every IP to have their own individual film to build them up first before you smush them all together. And the fact that Scoob didn't means it was already on rocky grounds. But then, do you remember the final act of this movie? I mean, it feels like a fever dream of drinking when I remember it. Because it turns out that Scooby-Doo is in fact a godly deity, and is connected to a great long range of dog gods, and like he sacrifices himself, and then Shaggy does, and then he lives anyway. I don't know, man. Add on to the fact that Scooby-Doo was literally invented to be the opposite of a desirable dog with, you know, it's sort of like the bowed legs and like the over-the-grown snout, his, you know, tendency to overeat. It's meant to be an unlucky dog, a dog you don't want, a scaredy cat of a dog that's not your guardian, you know? Doesn't protect you from monsters, it's scared of it as well. So to take that and then say, oh no, actually, he is a god and he comes from a line of successful whatevers, also just horrendously doesn't understand the original IP set to build off this cinematic universe. But on top of the fact that it clearly failed conceptually, because that is a big ask, and it is Warner Brothers, the actual conversation around this movie similarly just kind of happened, and then fizzled away. And it's not to say that there was no chance for this movie, you know, they had some really nice wholesome moments. Having a prequel moment where we see how Shaggy and Scooby met, really lovely and wholesome. It's to the point that every animated movie about an animal now has an origin prologue. I'm looking at you, Garfield movie. Thank you for making it halfway through this video. As per usual, do check below to see that you are subscribed. And let's reminisce the days of 4 years ago. Do you know where you were when the Scoob movie came out? Did this really help you in your lockdown days? And what do you think of this damn Scoob movie? Whether you have positive or negative opinions on the film, I say they're all valid and I'd love to hear about them. Either in the YouTube comments or over on our Discord server. It's a place to talk with fellow-minded animated movie fans. Anyway, enough of me plugging my own stuff in my own stuff. Let's get back to Scoob and their 4-year anniversary. But really, since the 4 years this movie came out, it made, you know, a ripple. I'm saying that Garfield movie is totally inspired by Scoob. I mean, there could be all sorts of information and resources and references that could be basing itself off of. But beyond that, the Scoob franchise has similarly just disappeared in the last 4 years. In fact, it's not just disappeared like, oh no, they vanished. They were killed and buried. This is Warner Brothers we're talking about. Scoob back in 2020 was Warner Brothers at their least worst, I guess. Getting by, somewhat trying to sling around how many IPs they own in their monopolizing ways, sure. But at least they released their damn movies. Since then, of course, we've had more of the executive moves from David Zaslav trying to destroy the company from within. And the very animation studio that built this Scoob movie, Warner Animation Group, the same people behind the Lego movie, have since been decommissioned by some of these executive corner cuttings. And similarly, in a far more direct example of being dead and buried, there was in fact a Scoob sequel being created. I don't know how well known this is, known, considering Batgirl was kind of a bigger news piece at the time, but no, at one point there was going to be a Christmas special with the Scoob cast. I think it was even going to focus on the prequel child elements that would have been the highlight of the first Scoob movie. Maybe it doesn't expand into a cinematic universe, but to expand it into a franchise of its own with sequels and the likes would have been great. And I heard that it was one of those cases where it was even made as well, or at least partially made, and then axed completely, and we haven't seen it since, now have we? That being said, was this movie special? It's Warner Brothers, and it's Warner Brothers. They have some great stuff, and they don't know how to use it seems. I'm not saying that I really want to have seen a Scoob sequel, but it would be wrong of me to say that it was completely terrible all the way through every single frame, and that it had no potential whatsoever. It did have potential. There were a lot of directions they could have expanded. They could have continued with just the young cast like they kind of wanted to, and that could have been its own franchise of its own. They could have even continued with more mysteries with just the Scooby Gang, or expanded more elements of the cinematic universe. You know, it would be great to see more Dick Dastardly doing things. I'd certainly watch it. Imagine they did a 3D Wacky Races movie. I would be so on board with that. Even if you do take a standard like 20-minute episode and expand it to 90, I could see the whole plotline, and I'd still want to see it. But of course, with anything with potential, you can always trust that modern Warner Brothers will absolutely squander it. Instead, they would go on to create a cinematic universe by basing it in real life, and then using that to just show off all the franchises they own. Space Jam 2 is technically a cinematic universe, only because it can go, hey look, we own all of these things, and we're not going to release anything with any of them. Whoa, it's LeBron James. Now, maybe this movie was doomed from the start. It was a mid-lockdown movie, mind you. Not to mention, it was kind of a straight-to-streaming movie. With it being lockdowns, of course, theatrical releases weren't a thing, and I do remember this being somewhat live-streamed out to a US audience. Or at least, it was live-streamed on YouTube to say, start watching the movie now. It's a whole thing. Either way, maybe it was always going to be doomed in some regards, and to a Warner Brothers executive, that's enough to axe it in the first place. But it also had a lot going for it, and really, it's just kind of another Warner Brothers casualty. It was kind of terrible, kind of tragic. It had all sorts of disadvantages pulling it down, and yet I'm still kind of sad that it's not still getting any sort of representation now. Scooby-Doo, of course, will be big enough that it's probably being represented in 3 different forms right now anyway, in normal TV series that I don't watch. But the impact felt by this movie is smaller than it could have been. Maybe it was just the right enough. It was just a simple, run-of-the-mill Scooby-Doo movie you could enjoy at the time, and that's about all it is. It really helped with passing the 2-year time we had to wait in lockdown, and I guess that's all it needs to be. Any impact it has made on the animation industry is just more of the classic tropes. Get a little bit of that prequel origins in there. Maybe make your villains more fun. I doubt that they influenced Bowser though, let's be honest. And please, for the love of God, don't turn the characters into gods in the final third act. I think a lot of movies certainly learned from that because I haven't seen it since. and maybe I'll try and forget that it happened in the first place. But yeah, 4 years have already passed since Scoob released to the masses, or at least some of the masses. And it's both a shame and a blessing that there really hasn't been much more talking about it since then. Warner Brothers will then go on to make more movies and then axe them, bury them away, and if we're lucky, at least Wile vs. Coyote will get a leak somewhere along the way. I know I'm certainly hoping for it. Perhaps Coyote vs. Acme can run because Scoob walked, stumbled, and then was buried. But I guess we'll just have to see. It is a David Zaslav's Warner Brothers world after all. For now though, I'm going to end it off there. My name's been Daz. Thank you very much for making it to the end of this video. As per usual, do let us know your opinions on this movie down below or over on our Discord server. Look at all these movie discussions that can happen sometimes. I love it when that happens. So come join. And I shall see you in a little bit.